Hello everyone. Today we're going to continue with our Max Beginner Series tutorials, and this is going to finish us up on the Beginner Series. We're going to get into rendering today. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Max. I already have a scene ready to render. Rendering is something that you do at the end of your project usually. Um, that's kind of sort of the final product. So whenever you get finished with your project, and you're ready to output it to a certain type of file, which could be just a basic image file or a 3D animation, you can do that through the rendering. So whatever you see here in the viewport isn't actually what your final product is going to look like. This viewport is just a graphic representation of what it's going to be before it's rendered. The rendering actually goes in and puts in reflections and shadows and transparencies and all that kind of good stuff that makes it look realistic. So, so the rendering is just as important as any other part of the project. So again, this is after you got all your lights in, your cameras, your modeling done, and along the way you usually want to have some type of a test render going. So at certain stages you may want to do a test render to make sure your materials are working correctly and your lighting is working correctly. And then when you get to the end of your project, you should be ready to do a final render. And again, you can do a single render, which is just going to output to a single image, or you could do an animation render, which is going to render out multiple image files in the sequence, which it will output to an animation. All right. One quick way to render is to do the Shift Q, and this is a quick render. So Shift Q is your hotkey for your quick render, and this brings up a render window, which kind of gives you the whole view of what your render is going to look like. And you can notice that this render size is different from viewport size. Okay, so not necessarily everything that's going to you see in your viewport is going to be in your render, and vice versa. So a lot of times what you'll want to do is you want to go up here and right click on this viewport title, and sometimes you want to say show safe frames, which you can also do a Shift F. Now these safe frames show you the exact boundaries of your rendering image, and these different boxes represent what will be clipped on a TV screen and what will be shown. In a lot of the old style TVs, the screen had a bevel, so this would kind of show you what that bevel fall off would be on your rendered image. So you want to stay usually within this blue line of your rendered image. So all of your action should usually stay in between or inside that blue line. Anything outside that blue line is going to start getting outside your rendered area. To open up your render dialog box, which will control all your render options, you can go to the main toolbar and go to render setup. Now this has all the options for your rendering. You can see there's five tabs here: common, render elements, ray tracer, and advanced lighting. The common tab is usually where you want to start out. It's got the basic stuff like how you want to output. If you want to output to a single image, output to an animation, which would be active segment, or render out a range of frames. Say you only want to render frame 0 through 60, you can type that in here. Also you can skip frames, so it gives you an example of if you wanted to render frames 1, 3, and then 5 through 12, you could do that here. You can change all that. Also an area to render. This gives you different options on what to render. If you wanted to do some test renders and you only wanted to render a certain object in the scene, you can do like a render selected, and it's just going to render around that selected object. You could render region, crop, blow up. There's lots of different options here. This output size section, this is actually the resolution of your rendering. So you have some presets here. You can also override these presets by right-clicking on them, and you can change those here. You have some output sizes here already set for you if you wanted to go through these. If you already know that you're going to be rendering out to an IMAX version, then you can choose one of those here. Or a certain type of camera, you can choose one of those. And then this next section is all your options for what is rendered in your viewport. If you want to turn on and off atmospherics effects, turn off your displacement, if you want to render hidden geometry, so on and so forth. All these are pretty self-explanatory. Also, you can tell it whether you want to calculate advanced lighting, or if you want to do just a simple test render without having to sit and wait on the advanced lighting to be calculated. You can do that here. But basically, when you go in to set up your rendering, first thing you want to do is decide if you want to render a single image or a set of frames for animation. And then you'll need to set your resolution, so you choose one of these. Then the next thing you do is go down to Files. This is where your output is going to be. So if you want to save the file to a certain location, you can do that here. If you're doing a set of images, you choose an image file. If you're doing an animation file like an AVI, you can do that. Choose that here. So here are all your different types of output files. Again, if you choose one of these image files, it's going to render out an image for every frame of that animation. So for example, if you have this animation that's 100 frames, it's going to render out 100 images for this project and put them in whatever folder you tell it to, and it will number those in sequence. Some of these other tabs, this renderer tab, this has all the options for whatever renderer that you're using. So let's go back to the Common tab. By default, in this version of Max, it defaults to using a scanline renderer, which means that when I click render here, also make sure that whatever viewport you have active is the one that you want to render in. So we want, of course, this camera view to be rendered. So I click render. Don't want to save the output there. Render. There it goes. And you can see it did a real quick scan of that image. It's just one line, scans across this one image and renders, calculates everything, the lighting, the shadows, the reflections, all at one time as it scans down. And that is the default renderer that comes with Max. But you can also choose a different renderer here with this little dialog box. Say if we wanted to change it to the mental ray renderer and use our mental ray materials. Now we're getting different options here in the renderer tab. You can see all these options are changed a little bit. So now they're dealing more with mental ray options. You also have some different processing and indirect illumination options here. So a lot of how these tabs are shown depend on what renderer you're choosing or what renderer you're using. With the mental ray renderer, it's going to render in buckets. Buckets are squares that it takes chunks of the image and renders each chunk individually, and the number of buckets is determined by your processor. So if you have, for example, a dual processor, then you'll have 2 buckets. If you have a dual quad, you'll have, in essence, 8 buckets. So that's where your processing speed and processing power really comes into play whenever you get into rendering in Max. So the first pass, it calculates the lighting, and then the second pass is kind of like a final iteration where it renders the finer points of the image. And that's really the basics of rendering. We're going to get into more advanced parts of rendering later on, and we're going to even get into the new Iray renderer, and we're going to get into more of a lot of these settings, doing special types of renderings, also using some of these options like material override, and adjusting the memory options using render elements for rendering in conjunction with other software like Combustion. And there's lots and lots of stuff to cover here, but I just wanted to cover the basics of rendering so you'll know how exactly to go in, and once you got something that you want to render, you'll be able to render it real quick. Just go in and tell it whether you want to render a single frame or an animation, what resolution you want to choose, and then where you want to put that file. And that's really the 3 main things you got to remember. And then click hit render and make sure you got the viewport active that you want to render from. And there you go. I hope you've got a lot out of this beginner series, and come back and join us, and we're going to start in on the intermediate series, and then on to the advanced series in Max.